So, a court in Japan has made a decision that could completely redraw the line between religious freedom and state power. Today, we're going to dive into a legal challenge that says this decision goes way too far, and we're going to break down exactly why.
Okay, so what's this all about? At the center of it all is a ruling from the Tokyo High Court to dissolve the Family Federation for World Peace and Unification. Now, dissolving a group, that's basically the legal death penalty for an organization. It's usually safe for the most serious crimes. But here's the kicker. This order isn't based on criminal acts, it's based on civil disputes, mostly about financial donations.
In response, this legal memorandum lands on the desk of Japan's Supreme Court. And it argues this isn't just some simple legal disagreement. It's a full-blown constitutional crisis in the making. We're talking about religious freedom, the limits of state power, and even international law. So let's break down what it says.
All right, here's how we're going to tackle this. We're going to follow the memorandum's logic step by step. First, we'll look at why this dissolution order is so unusual to begin with. Then, we'll dig into its three big constitutional arguments. One on religious freedom, another on whether the punishment fits the crime, and a third on how this stacks up against international standards. And finally, we'll see what the memorandum is actually asking the Supreme Court to do about it.
First up, let's get our heads around why this case is making so many waves in the legal world.
Okay, so here's the thing you really need to get. Dissolving a religious group has always been the last resort for the most extreme situations. I'm talking organized terrorism, murder, that kind of thing. The memorandum argues that to use this nuclear option for civil disputes, which are really just private financial disagreements, is a massive and, frankly, a pretty dangerous leap in the law. And that leads us right into the first major pillar of the memorandum's challenge. This one goes straight to the core of Japan's constitution, the freedom of religious association. You know, the memorandum makes a really interesting point here. This right is so fundamental it's actually protected twice in the Constitution, once under freedom of religion and then again under freedom of assembly. This isn't just about paperwork. It's about the very right for people to practice their faith together as a community. So from that perspective, a dissolution order is seen as a final, irreversible attack on that freedom for thousands of people.
Now, this slide here is absolutely key to understanding their argument. The memorandum claims the court is using a legal precedent from the Ajam Shinrikyo case, the group responsible for a deadly terrorist attack on the Tokyo subway. The memo basically says, hold on, you're comparing a mass murder event to financial disagreements. It argues that's not just mixing apples and oranges, it's a massive legal error.
Another huge piece of their argument is this compliance declaration the organization made way back in 2009. The document insists this wasn't just for show. It argues this marked a real turning point, a major shift in practices, and a serious attempt to fix the very problems that were causing these civil complaints in the first place.
And they don't just say things changed, they bring the receipts. Get this, the memorandum states that after that 2009 declaration, the amount of court-ordered damages related to donations dropped by 99.75%. That's a staggering number.
And to put that in perspective, look at this. Since 2009, the total court-awarded damages came out to just 0.003% of all donations received. So the memo's point is pretty blunt. These problems became statistically tiny. They argue they were no longer a systematic issue, which makes them ask, how can you possibly justify the ultimate penalty for that?
Right? So if the problems were shrinking so dramatically, the next logical question is dissolution even the right tool for the job? This brings us to their second big argument, that this penalty is just completely out of proportion to the actual problem.
This all boils down to something called the proportionality principle. It's a huge concept in constitutional law. The idea is really simple. The government's solution can't be more extreme than necessary. Basically, you don't use a sledgehammer to crack a nut. The memorandum argues that doing so isn't just bad policy, it's unconstitutional.
So what could they do instead? Well, the memorandum has a few ideas. First, it points out that new laws have already been passed to deal with these exact kinds of donation issues. So why not use them? Second, it highlights the organization's own internal compensation system. And third, it argues that dissolution should only ever be on the table as an absolute last resort, after everything else has been tried and has failed.
Now, this next point is really fascinating and kind of counterintuitive. They call it the reversal of relief. The memorandum argues that dissolving the group would actually hurt victims. How? Well, right now, the organization has a compensation fund of over $10 billion.
yen, that can flexibly pay people, even for old claims. If you dissolve the group, that's gone. It gets replaced by a rigid legal liquidation process where a huge chunk of the money gets eaten up by legal fees, and strict rules would actually make it harder, not easier, for many people to get paid.
All right, the third and final major argument zooms out from Japan and looks at the bigger global picture. It argues that this dissolution order violates Japan's own commitments to international human rights law.
So the memorandum reminds the court, hey, Japan signed international treaties. It points to things like the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, which puts a really, really high bar on restricting religious freedom. It also brings up protections for religious minorities and notes that the UN has specifically warned Japan before about using vague justifications like public welfare to take away people's rights. And that's where they get to this pretty sharp accusation. The memorandum points out that other religious groups have had similar lawsuits over donations, but none of them have ever faced dissolution. It asks a pretty blunt question. Why is this group being singled out? This raises the serious concern that this might be selective enforcement against a religious minority.
And they warn this could create what's called a chilling effect. The idea is that if this case sets a precedent, it could send a terrifying message to all other religious groups, especially smaller ones. The message would be, if you get enough civil lawsuits against you, your entire existence could be on the line. The fear is that this would just stifle religious activity across the board.
Okay, so after laying all of this out, what does the memorandum actually want the Supreme Court to do? It doesn't just ask them to say no. It actually proposes a whole new framework for how to handle cases like this in the future.
It proposes a brand new, super strict 4-part test that any future dissolution order based on civil disputes would have to pass. First, the bad acts have to come from the top and be as malicious as a crime. Second, every single other option must have already been tried and failed. Third, you have to prove that dissolution won't actually make it harder for victims to get relief. And fourth, you have to protect the rights of the current non-offending members to practice their faith.
And, no surprise, after proposing this test, the memorandum concludes that the High Court's order in this case fails, well, on every single point. Therefore, it argues, the decision is unconstitutional and has to be thrown out.
Ultimately, this whole thing forces a confrontation with a huge, timeless question. When a state steps in to protect its citizens, where do you draw the line between necessary regulation and trampling on fundamental religious freedom? That's the question now sitting with Japan's highest court, and whatever they decide will have consequences that go far beyond just this one case.